All right, so in the beginning, a little late here tonight because I'm trying to do a few too many things all at once. Doing some cooking in the kitchen for another project, but world building in the beginning. So how does the world begin? And that's one of the big things I've been playing with, along with, semi-related to the magic system that I was playing with recently. I shouldn't still wear my work shirts on these videos, but anyway, when I was working on the magic systems for the non-Vancian magic, I was discussing things like healing magic, and there is a topic in gameplay that I will probably have to address at a certain point, which involves healing, rest, and the afterlife. A lot of those games have some mechanics for dealing with those, but I feel like moving a little bit more towards the world building aspect of this for game world design, and less in the nitty gritty of the mechanics of it. I think one of the things I potentially want to do for this is I'd love to see if I could get some of my friends and associates to get together and do a live game of Dungeons and Dragons for charity or something like that. I got to figure that one out. But I'm also looking at the possibility of doing single player adventures. So basically, there's a way you can play by yourself with Dungeons and Dragons. And I think what I want to try to do is play test some of my gameplay mechanics and stuff live. Well, maybe not live. I could record them and edit them down. But I'd like to explore it a little bit further. But this episode, I thought would be nice to talk about how the universe began. And I could read the little bit that I have here. The cosmos dawned with a violent throwing off of the tyranny of order that has not yet come to pass, filling the pristine, uncomplicated nothing with a seething cacophony of existence and a menagerie of rebels, neither controlled by nor in control of all the powers of being, but nonetheless symbiotically joined to them. So basically, the way I came up with this idea for the universe is when you look at stories of like Rip Van Winkle or the universe being built in 7 days, it's all kind of really done in a way that sort of suggests that time doesn't pass the same everywhere. And with that idea in mind, I've always built these stories and concepts of a universe where when you step out into the realm of the divine, maybe things aren't as linear as we think they are. And especially if you're talking about creatures of chaos. And so what I wanted to do was take this idea that hundreds or thousands or millions of years in the future, when the universe is in the midst of a battle between the last dregs of order and the last dregs of chaos, that the rebels of chaos might actually, because divine beings may not be bound by time the same way we are, that they could move fluidly back and forth between it, sort of like Time Lords and Doctor Who stuff, Or if you've ever watched Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the beings, the wormhole beings that live in the wormhole, they don't experience time in a linear fashion either. And so this premise of the divine realm not experiencing time in the same way, and especially chaotic beings like a Cthulhu or something like that, could potentially not experience time in the same way. Even if you look at like biblical legends for Judeo-Christian stuff, specifically the idea that the beings, the human beings who were good and just people who existed before Christ, supposedly, if you listen to a lot of Christianity, it says things to the effect of, if you have not um, have not accepted Christ as your Savior, you do not have a doorway into heaven. And so that premise that like without Christ you can't get into heaven, but Christ happened halfway through human history as far as they're concerned. So all the people, even all the good benevolent people at the dawn of humanity, they all go to hell because they didn't accept Christ, who hadn't been born yet. Well, if you take that myth, if you take that story, and you suppose that, well, in our realm, he hadn't been born yet, but what's to say that he can't, the people who came before him didn't die, 2,000, 3,000 years BC, and on the moment of their death, they access a point in not time in which all things after that, like somebody 2000 BC and somebody 2000 years from now could die and show up in the afterlife at the same moment if we don't have to exist on a linear timeline after death. So with that kind of sort of concept in mind, and you look at things like the story of Rip Van Winkle, the guy who partied with fairies for one night and came back to his own world 200 years later, or any of those kinds of concepts of time being a little weird when you step outside our realm, that makes it seem to me like a thing worth playing with in this mythology. And so I built this idea that perhaps if you were to look at a structure of the universe, you would potentially have the orderly tyrants and power sources of divine beings warring in heaven with chaos beings. And eventually you'd come to a point very much like the Terminator movies where the war could go either way at the end and it's just coming to an end. So they send a Terminator and a person to defeat the Terminator both back in time before it all even happens. And the Terminator movie does this thing where you couldn't have the hero of the rebellion exist if you hadn't sent his best friend back in time to become his father. They also have this thing where Skynet couldn't have existed to destroy the world if the Terminator that was created by Skynet in the future wasn't sent back in time, and its remains were found by the company that owned that warehouse at the end, and the chip in its head was used to build the first structures that led to Skynet. That sort of like the present is caused by events in our past that are influenced by events that have yet to happen. That sort of play on that stuff, that seems like great mythological playground for me. So what I did was I took the idea of creatures of chaos, monsters like Cthulhu and those types of Lovecraftian horrors living beyond the edges of the universe, burst into the nothingness that existed before the universe. So it's not even like, it's not a universe leading into the next universe. It's the end of this universe linking to the beginning of this universe and kicking it off so that the universe only exists because the end of this universe started it all. It's a bit of a mind bend. And I think that's kind of a cool concept to do a kind of like it's hard to wrap your brain around. Of course it is, because it's the playground of things like Cthulhu and the Titans and the Olympian gods that do all these impossibly weird things. Zeus spawned Athena by splitting his head open, and out came Athena fully grown. Like, those are impossibly mythological weirdnesses that we just accept as part of that mythological cycle. And so I like the idea of the universe starting by creatures from the end of the universe bursting into the nothingness that existed before, well, didn't quite exist, didn't either exist or not exist, but the appearance of things from the end of the universe ripping open the universe into a beginning is the thing that starts the universe. And so the universe goes from, like I said here, the phrase I used for it was filling the pristine, uncomplicated nothing with a seething cacophony of existence and a menagerie of rebels, neither controlled by nor in control of all the powers of being. So at this point, nothing has ever been before, and nothing is being until that moment where the nothing that doesn't exist gets ripped wide open, and that ripping of it brings forth beings that are rebelling against a time that hasn't happened yet. And they come into this being, and they're symbiotically joined to the very nature of being. And these are the great old ones. They build this bubble of chaos in the middle of the nothing that they push back. And from there, I've kind of philosophically built around that idea, the idea that when you do randomness, when you have chaos and randomness, patterns can spontaneously emerge. Emergent evolution, emergent patterns happen through randomness. And so I've sort of set this up as these chaos beings. They're not anymore like, I tend to think of it as like, you look a lot of H.P. Lovecraft kind of stuff, and their elder gods, the elder ones, tend to have this malevolent consciousness, this awareness and reasoning, but it's reasoning in a random, weird way that we can't wrap our brain around. I've sort of built the first chaos beings as being less nefariously and malevolently sapient and more just sort of barely sentient, like starfish or sea anemones. Like they don't have a moral value. They don't have an intent. They don't have a philosophy. They sense their environment, they interact with it, and they do things, but they don't have an intent. And I feel like that's that sort of wild, neither malicious nor beneficent entity is fitting for a chaotic being. It just is. It lives, it does things, but there is no rhyme or reason for most of it. There's not even much of a pattern. It just does things like an amoeba. There's absolutely no reason to try to imagine, why would an amoeba do that? It just does things. It's part of its living process. And so I like the idea of just giant seething divine entities that function on that same kind of principle. They just are. They do things. It's part of their being. And from those beings, you have also the effect of having shredded the nothingness to appear within our universe. Those emergent patterns of chaos can also spawn order. If you roll dice hundreds of times in a row, sometimes you'll get a pattern. It just happens. And so part of the chaotic beginning of the universe is the dawning of some of the first order that exists in the universe. So we went from nothingness to chaos to order, all emerging within this chunk of existence. And from that emergent existence of order, I frame them as the first mothers. They're sort of vestiges of the way I phrase it. From the sundering came the first mothers, vestiges of what came before the beginning. So basically, in my story of how I've built this out, the players are going to play young gods, and they're going to confront circumstances that can shatter them back into individual humans who carry a little spark. Like, I might be the heart of one god, and you might be its liver, and we don't have to be connected to each other to do that, but that being exists because each of us exist, like the cells of my body exist, and I can only exist so long as my cells exist. And so it'd be the equivalent of me shattering into individual cells, and each one of those cells having a bit of awareness of who I was before I was shattered. So that's the way I've built my campaign to run. And a version of that kind of took place where at the beginning, well, before the beginning, there was a nothingness, a no time, a no space nothingness. And when the chaos erupted from the future into that nothingness, its shredding of that nothingness was like shredding me into my individual cells. So those shreds, those vestiges of that time before the beginning, are called the first mothers. And they fought against the chaos as their appearance was sort of part of that emergence of order within the chaos. And so that war, that erupting war between chaos and the first mothers, they clawed and bit and fought and stabbed and punched through chaos in a messy combat. And in biting and consuming and shredding each other, there was an absorption of chaos into order, and the combination of that, the first mothers each held within themselves a new world coming into being. And on that world were their unborn children. And so on this world that we live on right now, we are within one of the first mothers idea. So each of the worlds that I built, my superhero universe, my zombie apocalypse universe, my Medusa universe, my Stone Against the Tide universe, each one of these universes is the unborn within one of the first mothers. And when you have that dawn of being, you have this world where little shards of, we get some traits from the first mother, and we get some traits from the energy consumed from the chaos beings. And what we get from that is all life coming into being on that world. And it comes into being, it lives an entire life. So we live our entire lives on this world that is the unborn world within the first mother. And then on the day of our death, we are actually born into the other realm from one of those first mothers. And that's sort of the mythology I've built around how the universe came into being, how the first set of entities, the elder gods, came into being, and how the worlds, the multi-worlds, came into being. Now, within the body of the first mothers, each of those life forms that come into being on those unborn worlds, they are, in essence, the children of the elder gods and the first mothers. And so they have the same genetics as the divine beings that those are. And they're birthed into the world, and they fight alongside against chaos. Some other story bits that I'm not going to spoil come into play there, but what you end up having is they are the first, what we would consider sort of traditional gods. The Cronus, the Titans, the Fomorians, all the previous existing entities that came before the Olympian gods, and the Thoth Danann for the Celtic mythology. All the ones that came first, but not first. But we think of Cronus as being, the father of the gods, and he came before Zeus. But if I remember correctly, the very first being in existence was Rhea. And she spawned Uranus, who spawned Saturn, who is Cronus, I believe. So it was basically Rhea came into being first. She was the world. And she had either a brother or a son who became the air, the sky. And between the two of them, they birthed the Titans. So the earth was born and either birthed the sky or had a brother in the sky. And between the two of them, they birthed the Titans. The Titans birthed the Olympian gods. And the Olympian gods overthrew the Titans, but you almost never hear the stories of Rhea or Gaia and Uranus, or I forget if he had another name or not. But so those very first beings that spawn into existence the rest of the pantheon, I want the first children born into the realm of chaos and first mothers to be like the Titans. But I also want them to be the ones that sort of get to a point where they are the rulers of certain kingdoms. So the kingdom of Olympus, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of Shangri-La, or however you want to call it. It doesn't matter what you call it, just that they become sort of emperors. Because the way I want the game to start is for characters to feel like they are ordinary people, not to be aware of the fact that they're gods from the beginning. They're just ordinary people living in a world that has these kingdoms ruled by a god emperor, essentially. And those rulers, the Greek pantheon and the Persian pantheon are going to be in conflict with one another at some point in history, especially if you look at the Norse mythology does this fairly well, where they talk about there was a war between the Aesir and the Vanir. And as part of a peace arrangement between those two tribes of gods, they exchanged hostage people. So Freya and Freyr are not the same race of gods that Thor and Odin are. They're part of that exchange. They come from the Vanir. And that same concept is sort of what I want to exist, as these divine beings fought amongst each other, and now there's sort of a Cold War and a moderate truce going on between everybody. And that allows the kingdoms or the empires of each of them to prosper. And so you're going to have like a United Nations, and then you're going to have the individual empires ruled over by god emperors. And then within those empires, you're going to have political intrigue in and of itself. And all this is happening in a world where nobody believes in gods above them. The closest thing they have to a god is their god emperor. And but unbeknownst to those players, that lack of a higher level figure, they are the divinity above the rest of the worlds. And so I want them to be able to explore that world as if they're individual human beings within a world, and gradually uncover the nature of the world they live in and who they are, and then face some of those conflicts that are brought about within that world. And as a consequence of some of these conflicts, potentially be broken into your individual parts, living on the individual worlds as single human lifetimes. And so it's sort of like coming from that never knowing you're a god, discovering that you're a god, and then discovering what makes a god is the beings it's composed of, the individuals, the people, and figuring out where each one of those belongs in the step of figuring out if you were a god and you were shattered amongst all your parts, and you took the time to figure out like who each one of your parts were, learn the pieces that make you up, and how each of them can be so vastly different. How an eyeball is completely different than a heart, and how a liver is completely different than a thigh bone. And yet somehow all these constituent parts are made out of living pieces that are self-contained lives, but they can make up a bigger thing. And what makes that thigh bone my thigh bone? What makes that heart my heart and not just some random heart? Would it matter? And, you know, in that sense, taking a look at a character, a person, exploring what it means to be them. So the players are going to make their character, their god that they play with to start with, and figure out what makes that thing. Because when you go to World 1 and you examine a piece of it, that piece may be different from the next world you go to and examine a different piece. But they're part of the same being. They have the same identity. They're different parts of it. What makes them part of the same thing? It's not like you can just slap together any 5 organs and have a functioning life form. How is each one distinctly its own thing, but also a component of a greater thing? And, you know, having players who build characters that are fighters and magic users and healers and nature-loving creatures and vicious assassins, and at the end of it all say, those are me. Those make up who I'm playing. What does that say about who you are? And it's very Jungian. I don't know if you've ever studied any psychology, but I majored in psychology when I went to college for a long time. I didn't finish my major, but I did major in it for a while. And Jungian psychology has this tendency to look at, we have our different aspects of ourselves. If you look at, what's his name? Freud. The proposal of ideas of like the id, the ego, and the superego as components of who we are. And then taking it even further, you have the idea of Jungian psychology talking about the shadow self. Why are we losing connection? I don't know what's going on with this. Anyway, Jungian psychology acknowledges that there's another self, a self we don't present to the world, that we sometimes hide even from ourselves. So if you're exploring those concepts of your connection is unstable, I'm probably going to wrap this up real quick here, because if it's going to keep doing that, there's no point in trying to do this if it's going to break every time I do a video here. And it's my own fault because I removed the webcam to do something else in a different room today, and every time I plug it in, it looks like it has to readjust to its existence. I don't understand why it does this. Anyway, yeah, it's going to drop the signal again soon here. Yeah, the multifaceted human being with different pieces of itself, but all being aspects of itself. And what makes it possible for them to be different from each other, but all still be part of one thing? And that's sort of what I'm trying to do with this. And it all stems from the idea I referenced earlier, where that theme spreads out throughout the entirety of that hierarchical system. Like, you had the nothingness, and when that nothingness was split, you have vestiges of that thing in the form of the first mothers. And then each of those birthed whole worlds as daughter worlds, or however you want to think of them. And on those worlds were slivers of beings that are humans and animals and trees. And those beings came into existence, lived a simple life, died, and in passing into the afterlife are birthed into the realm of the first mothers. And each one of those things has the ability to gather and gain its own power and grow. And each one of those things can be shattered into a myriad of little pieces that are vestiges on the worlds within themselves. And so this idea of this breaking and reassembling of things is sort of key to the world that I'm building. And maybe I'm overbuilding it. That's okay. I don't mind having a little bit of fun doing that. But so this overbuilt world that I've been playing with is part of my world building process. The idea of this elaborate sequence of events and histories and interconnections that make a rich world. Now, you'll notice that none of that is telling you what type of player character you can have and what your character can do. There are no limits on that. You can play whatever type of character you want to play, and you can do whatever seems right in that world. But it does build a world for things to happen in. So the plane that the first mothers live on and fight against the chaos beings, that plane, that is the level ground on which the rest of the story takes place. And the emperor gods, they've built their little empires on floating cities. And those floating cities drift above the ground, and they're pristine, they're orderly, they're nicely maintained, controlled structures that serve a purpose and have a role to play in the systems that are built for each of the emperor kings, the emperor tyrants, the god emperors. Each one of those beings has a rigidly structured world they live in at the top of. And each of those realms is a city-state. It's an Athens or a Sparta. And those city-states have the equivalent of the Bifrost Bridge from Norse mythology. So they can send a bridge down to the larger plane they float above. And on that plane beneath them is a whole rich world of chaotic life and entities and spirits birthed into that realm by the first mothers. So I think I've pretty much figured out how that all works. There may be some additional tweaking at certain points to fix it up a little bit as we go, but overall I think that's it. And considering the connection problems I'm having tonight, I think it's time to call it here. I don't know why it's behaving like this lately, but I didn't disconnect this camera yesterday. And I think it dropped the signal a couple times yesterday too. Not happy that this keeps happening. I don't know why. I guess we'll find out. But until then, take care and have a good night. Where are you? Oh, for pity's sake, are you even doing anything? All right, take care and good night. I can't seem to get any of my stuff to work tonight. But hopefully I'll get some Roving Jack stuff up in the coming week. That's the goal. And maybe even my other channel too. And maybe more on here as we go. Let's see what we can do, shall we?